right, hello everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Renzo from the Open Government Partnership, OGP. Thank you for the introduction and for having me. Let's talk anti-corruption and open data. I'll start with a story of Andrej Babiš, the former Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. Something you should know about him, he loves to have a good time. So much so that he was found to be secretly buying property in France and is currently being prosecuted for stealing money from the European Union. What happened? Well, the EU was supposed to give subsidies to small farms. And our friend Andrej Babiš owned Agrofert, the biggest agro-industrial company in the Czech Republic, too big to merit any subsidies. So what's a rich man to do? He split Agrofert, created a small subsidiary that got all of the money from the EU, and then afterwards reincorporated it into Agrofert. Productive day in the office, right? So how do we know all of this? Well, it starts with what he did with the money. So he had to hide it somehow. He had to clean it. And to do this, he used a series of shell companies to hide the money and buy property in France. And he used a series of legal firms, banks, shell companies, so that nobody could trace the money back to him. Except we did. How? Well, a whole bunch of people and a whole bunch of data was needed to make this happen. So let's run through it here. At the bottom right here of the map, we had Czech civil society figuring out who owned companies that were receiving subsidies from the European Union. But there wasn't any data in the Czech Republic on who owns companies. So they actually used data from Slovakia. And they connected it with data used by Danish journalists that they had requested from the government to see who was getting the EU subsidies. Then the French government was publishing data on who owns land in France, so they were able to connect the dots that Babiš owned Agrofert, Agrofert had received money from the European Union, and then Babiš had deposited that money in France, French property. And then the leak of the Pandora Papers provided the evidence of the financial transaction and banking information to make it all click. Now we have prosecutors at the level of the EU and prosecutors in the Czech Republic that are prosecuting Babiš for this case, and the court case is ongoing. So what does this show? It shows a couple of things. One, the data is super important. Hopefully I can convince you of that. But the other thing it shows is that a single data set is not enough. It needs to be linked. It needs to go across borders, and similar to what Chris Barrett from OCCRP was saying yesterday, we need a network of people to combat these networks of corruption. So if I've convinced you that the data is important and that we need more of it, you may be interested to hear what I'm going to say next, which is that our research was looking at whether this data exists, and if it exists, where, and how good is it? So this is a project that we call Broken Links. You may guess why. So we partnered with a group called the Global Data Barometer, and they have researchers in over 100 countries that actually reviewed government websites and legislation to see if data is published and if it's even required to be collected or published. And we looked at several areas of anti-corruption. Here are just some of them. So, for example, do governments publish what politicians own, their assets, what they declare as their assets? Do they publish what political parties the income that they receive and their expenditures during campaigns? Like in the Babish case, do they publish who owns companies, who owns land, who lobbies the government, and who's winning public contracts? All very corruption-prone areas. So these are ones that we decided to focus on. So what did we find? I'm going to show you 3 main findings of the research. Okay. The first finding, broken links. The data is often not online. So to give you a couple of examples of all of the countries that we looked at, about 1/3 publish any data on who owns companies. Why so low? Well, a lot of countries have this data, but it's internal. It's not open to journalists, it's not open to public scrutiny, it's stored somewhere on a government database and stays there. In the case of lobbying, it's even worse. Only about 1/4 of governments publish any information on who lobbies them. And here, it's a different problem. It's not that the data is internal to government, it's that it doesn't exist. Nobody collects it. Very few governments have laws on the books requiring that lobbying information be collected in the first place. So many challenges, each area with its own challenge. But you might say, well, Renzo, at least some countries are publishing the data. That's progress, right? Well, not exactly, because the second main finding is that most of the data that we do see is low quality. And that's another way of saying that most of the data sucks. Why? First, it's so broad, it's very general, it lacks important details. I'll give you an example. A lot of governments publish the expenses and revenues of political parties during an election. But they don't publish who is actually donating, who are the donors, and how much money did those donors give, which is a critical piece of information. Or, in the case of asset declarations, governments will publish what the politicians own, but they don't publish what the close family members own. And that's an easy loophole where a lot of money gets diverted. The second problem is that the data is hard to use. And when I say hard to use, I don't mean that it's messy data that you need to wrangle to analyze. I mean PDFs, if you're lucky, a lot of scanned forms, image files that you have to actually dig through to use. So the data that we do have is not great either. And the third finding is that the data is not linked. As I said, one data set is not enough. It needs to be linked. It's not enough to know which company is winning a public contract. You need to know who owns that company. And did that person donate to political parties? Is that person a registered lobbyist with a certain politician? Those are the kind of connections that we need. And right now, there are very few identifiers linking politicians, linking assets, linking legislation. So this is like the frontier of open data for anti-corruption. Okay. This is all bad news, right? So I'm going to switch to good news. And that is that there are bright lights of innovation that we found in the research. And I want to present some of these here. So I'll start with a case of Colombia, where they introduced open contracting for school meals. So they started publishing who is winning the contracts to deliver school meals, and they opened up the bidding process. So everybody could see how much was being offered, how much different companies were offering for the services. And they published this all online. You could see different regions, how much was being spent over different time periods. You could see the names of suppliers. You could see how much money specifically was going into education and schools. And what was the result? They found out that there was a price-fixing scheme, that because only some companies knew of the procurement opportunities, they were selling their school meals for double the price of the market value. So once they opened up the procurement process, prices went down, they could afford more and better school meals. Another example from Paraguay. I'm from Peru, so that's why I'm biased with the South American examples. In Paraguay, the government started publishing data on expenses and assets, politician assets. But it was raw data, so very few people knew what to do with it. So this great civil society watchdog created a portal to make it easy for citizens to investigate the data and to report possible areas of corruption. So they started publishing which were the politicians that were actually submitting their asset declarations. The answer was not very many. That's all red. It should be green for the ones that are publishing there at the top. But more importantly, they were also able to track changes over time. And they found an example of a senator that declared an income 1 year, and then 2 years later was making 4,000% more money. So it was these kinds of cases that they were able to identify by crowdsourcing, opening the data up for people to investigate for themselves. So the last thing I want to mention is that those examples and those data sets are available for anyone to use. So you may be wondering, how do I access this data? I don't know where to look. There's so many government websites, and they're all publishing different things in different pieces. I don't know where to find it. It's a lot of work. So much like other colleagues have presented here at DataFest, I'm here to tell you that researchers have already done the work for you. So you can find the data sets much more easily. And this is just one tool that we're adding to that collection of information that organizations and individuals are putting together. We call this our Broken Links Data Explorer. And it includes all of the data sets on anti-corruption in the areas that I've mentioned for the 100 plus countries. So if you want to see what your country is publishing, you can find it in the Explorer, and if there is data available, I hope so, you can actually find the links to the raw data. So you can go in, look for yourself, see how bad it is, and advocate for more or make it easier for others to use. So to give you an example, I'm going to pick on Georgia. So this is from the Explorer. You can see that they do publish data on asset declarations, politicians that have to declare their assets. You can actually see, though, if the data is of high quality, which elements does it include or not include. In this case, they publish income for politicians, but they do not publish unique IDs that you can use to connect officials across data sets. You can also compare with other countries, and most importantly for us data geeks, you can actually access the raw files. So you can actually see all of the sources that the researchers found, all of the URLs that include the information. And this is the Explorer, but you can also find it in raw format if you want to download it in bulk and use it. So I'll end there. The last thing I will say is the data is not enough. We advocate for more, better, high-quality data, but obviously, for it to be impactful, it needs to be used. Like in the case of Andrej Babiš, we need people in government, we need prosecutors using this data, we need investigators, we need journalists, we need civil society, we need data experts, all using this data to uncover these networks of corruption. And if crime has no borders, then our data and our collaboration shouldn't either. Thank you.
When you describe the equation, whom we need, for instance, to prosecute such guys like Babiš, you forgot one element: whistleblowers. Because without whistleblowers, there would be no Panama Papers, there would be no any huge investigations. How we can deal without whistleblowers?
Great question. Yeah, so there's a separate piece of research that actually looks at cases of corruption uncovered within government, so not involving non-governmental groups. And they found that the vast majority of cases uncovered within government are due to whistleblowers. They're not due to internal investigations or ombudsmen or other government institutions. It's whistleblowers that are uncovering most cases of corruption. So absolutely, there has to be this network of collaboration both within government and outside of government. And that's at the heart of the model of OGP. So the Open Government Partnership is a partnership of government and civil society. And the idea is that the solutions don't come from just one group or the other. It has to be a collective of efforts. And the way we promote that is that government and civil society must meet together to come up with the priorities for addressing these issues, because the answers will look very different depending on the context. And so that takes into consideration not just the ministry that is in charge of publishing the information, but it takes into account all of these other voices. The civil servants that may one day become those whistleblowers. It takes into account neighborhood collectives, trade unions, journalists, different groups that are part of the solution, and they all need to be involved in designing the ultimate policy reforms.